All right, so when we talked about cartoons last week, you remember that we were talking about how a cartoon might have a slightly different contention or a slightly different argument to, say, an article that it's paired along with, whereas a photograph is always going to be embedded. It's always going to be part of a text rather than a text on its own. It's going to support or supplement the written material that you're given. And so it's really important to understand that they're selected because they have this powerful emotive impact. And they underpin or highlight other persuasive effects that are being used in the article. I think the idea that they are supporting the point of view is really important to understand. And this differs from cartoons because cartoons have their own author with their own set of opinions and their own argument to make. And so often they can correlate, but they could also potentially contradict the article that you've been reading, whereas a photo is going to particularly be chosen to be supporting that point. And you might remember me very hastily saying at the end that what you really need to think about, I guess, when you're looking at photos is the way in which the idea that you're answering essentially the question, why was this one chosen? Oh, I don't like that pen. We'll have to change that, won't we? So why was this chosen? And I think the important thing with that is to understand that the creators of the editors at the newspaper or the blog or with whatever text type it is that we're reading, they will have had a lot of different choices that they could have made for photographs. They'll have hundreds and hundreds of images to pick. And so the essential question that we're asking ourselves is, why? Why this one? Out of all the options that they had at their fingertips, why this one? So I think the dot points here help us to understand potentially what those choices were and what they were based on, because obviously highlighting an aspect of the issue, so injured victims in a war zone is the example there, that might be why that particular photo has been chosen. Showing a person's expression on their face, which is obviously going to allow for empathy or some sort of emotional response from the reader, to draw that out more easily is obviously another reason. And that links to that idea of empathizing with the people that are being pictured. And then I like this one. I haven't usually talked about this one, but I quite like this note. The idea that it presents the landscape, that it can emphasize beauty or ugliness of the setting, which obviously can have a positioning effect. And I can think of a number of articles that I've done with my students over the years that have pictured landscapes, and we've ended up talking about that, but it's not been usually something that I've thought is a main point of photos, because we're usually looking at photos of people particularly. But I think that that's a really good one to make. We can think about other sorts of graphic techniques and colour and how they can position in positive or negative ways. And those things, like angle or composition, framing, the choice of subject, where you place the subject in that space, etc., etc., can all help to position the reader either positively, as I said, or negatively, depending on the position being taken. So one of the things that's mentioned there is colour. Let me just grab my pen. So this idea of, grab the highlighter again, there we go. This idea of colour. And colour, as it says there, is really important, and in your book you'll only have a black and white version of the photo that we're about to look at. But I want to highlight just a couple of things. This is not by any means an exhaustive list, but certainly worthwhile just getting the mind going in terms of what we're about to look at. So I'll just highlight the colours first. White, green, red, undo that one. White, green, red, and black, just as examples. And just picking up on a few potentials, and I'll repeat that colour can be really varied in terms of what it suggests. So, for instance, white might represent purity, but it could also represent being naive. It could represent fear, because you obviously go white when you're afraid. You lose all the blood from your face, those sorts of things. So it really depends on how it's being used. Green often is there to suggest nature or freshness, but green can also, if used in a particular context, might represent ill health, if it's associated with a person. So it's fresh if it's associated with environment, but it would be ill health if it was associated with a person. Okay. Often, you're obviously not going to get a very easy photograph of someone who's literally green, but particularly when we're thinking about colour more generally, it's important to understand that. So red here, danger, anger, passion, real intense emotions are really important. But notice that sometimes those emotions, danger and anger, frustration, jealousy might all be, connotation with red, but passion or love, more positive ideas that might be associated with it as well. And then black, they've got here seriousness, but it can also represent death, or loss, and those sorts of things. Now, keep in mind that because the colour has lots of different connotations, you really need to make sure that it makes sense, the interpretation that you're making of that colour choice, with the context of the photo and the context of the issue, the context of the contention that's being made. All right, let's have a look at the Nicole Kidman photo that's here. This is a photo from 2007, and there's a little bit of background here, just to summarise. I won't read through it for you, but essentially a photographer, a paparazzi photographer working for Fairfax, had been maligned in the news by the Herald Sun, suggesting that he was behaving in an unscrupulous way, that he was destroying Nicole Kidman, a celebrity's private life, in the way that he was hunting photos of her. And he didn't like the way that Fairfax Media, he didn't like the way that Fairfax Media was portraying him, and he essentially sued them for destroying his reputation. But the judge actually found that the criticism that Fairfax Media had made of this photographer was substantially true, which is a defence to defamation. And so he actually lost the case against Fairfax. And the following picture that we're going to have a look at was in the Australian newspaper, taken by Lindsay Moller. So here we have the colour version. So you've got the black and white version in yours. So Nicole Kidman is obviously the subject, and she's located centrally. So you might remember when we looked at cartoons, we talked about elements. So we've got one element here in the form of Nicole Kidman, and she's at the centre of the photo, so she becomes the subject. And whoops, sorry, I've jumped pages there. My apologies. Let me just move that back in. There we go. So yeah, she's become the subject of the photo, placed at the center. So we're talking about framing there, but we can also talk about color. So, why this picture, why this image? Obviously the white color of her blouse and her jumper, her cardigan, obviously makes her look innocent. But notice also that her face, here is quite pale in terms of the way it looks. Look at where her eyes are looking. She's looking down. Even the fact that her mouth is slightly open here makes her look quite haggard or perhaps set upon. So she doesn't look happy. She, if you even look at her hand down here, there's certainly tension in the way that she's holding her fingers. She doesn't look content. We can also talk about the security guard who's in the foreground here. So this is another element. So we call this the foreground element of the security guard. You know, and he's clearing the way, which implies the idea that Kidman has been set upon, or that she needs protection. Her lawyer also is another element here. So this is this guy here. This is her lawyer. Can't think of his name, I'm sorry. But, you know, he's supporting her and also protecting her. You know, his arm is raised. This arm here sort of blocking off that paparazzi and the media storm that's following her. He's got his head up here, like he's about to answer a question, or he's telling the paparazzi to back off. You know, he's a protective figure. So we've got her on either side, here and here, protected by people, which implies the fact that she needs protection. The people that she needs protection from are actually not pictured. You know, if you have a look here, they're cameras, microphones. We've got a camera up the back here. We've got cameras here, a camera here, another microphone here. We actually don't see the people that are sort of crowding around her. So they're faceless, and I mean, the most we get probably is this guy's face just here. Maybe this person's face up the back here. But otherwise, we actually can't see the media. The media are represented almost symbolically by the cameras, which are part of the problem in the case and in the article themselves. So they're represented as faceless, and that has obviously fairly strong negative connotation. If we wanted to talk about the framing of the photo, so we've talked about the fact that Kidman is in the center. We've talked about the fact that she's crowded around her, you know, on either side with the paparazzi. But we can also talk about the fact that it's taken from a fairly high angle. So if you imagine, if you're looking at my little thumbnail video down there, imagine the photo has been taken from up above her. So it's like the guy in the background there, you know, holding his camera right up high and taking the photo down. And so by looking down on her, you still get a big idea of the fact that she's crowded in with all of these cameras. So it's pretty carefully selected photo to really make Kidman look like a victim, which by association means that the person that she's gone in to testify against in the case is a villain, or is a perpetrator of some sort of horrible action. Now, I think most of those notes are reflected in this summary down here for you. So if you didn't capture quite all of those in my annotations, which once they're all done look quite messy, it's recorded down below for you. But if I was writing about this photo, obviously I've got several elements that I could write about. So I've got, number one, the way that Kidman is portrayed as victim. I've got the people on either side of her, so the security guard or the lawyer as the second element. That is the figures around Kidman. And then the third element, I guess, is the surrounding framing of all the people standing around and crowding around her. And within each of those elements, I might talk about different pieces, like the choice of the hand placement, you know, the positioning of the camera, etc., etc. All right, so that's all represented on the bottom of that page. Now,